Thank you for joining the Nation conversation today. We have two extraordinary people to engage a subject that has roiled this country, and I suspect the world, but this country, book banning. And within book banning, there's much more, which we will talk about. The battle over books has heated up. The most recent wave of book banning is no less dangerous than book banning throughout history. I was looking at a Guardian article about Art Spiegelman, one of our guests, and they had pictures from the 50s of American Legion women throwing comic books into a junk dispenser and kids joining with their mothers. And you're reminded the cyclical history of the power of comic books. I want to begin with Viet Thanh Nguyen, who has joined us before, a Vietnamese American writer at the University of Southern California, 2016 Pulitzer Prize winner for his novel, The Sympathizer. And his published books include many: Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, The Refugees, and his recently released novel, The Committed, is the sequel to his celebrated debut. The Sympathizer, if I could, establish Nguyen as both a literary star and an advocate for displaced people around the world, which we see today in such tragic numbers and have seen over these last years. One of the leading public intellectuals in the literary world. He also writes regularly for the New York Times opinion page, and he had an end of January essay, just luminous, inspired by the latest controversy over Art Spiegelman's mouse. And he made the case I trust he'll make today about the importance of empathy in reading disturbing books. Art Spiegelman, since his early days in the underground comic scene, Art Spiegelman has reveled in saying the unsayable and subverting convention. In 1992, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his masterful Holocaust narrative, Mouse, which portrayed Jews as mice and Nazis as cats. Mouse 2 continued the remarkable story of his parents' survival during the Nazi regime and their lives later in America. He was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people, even though he's a troublemaker, and elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2018. He has been a great friend of the nation and given us many controversial covers, which we hope to see more of. I want to begin with Art, but open it up to Viet as well. So Mouse was recently in the news when Tennessee's McMinn County School Board voted in January to remove the book from its curriculum. An immediate result of the decision was soaring sales. Someone recently pointed out, if you truly want a teenager or a kid to read any book with gusto, the first thing you need to do is ban it. Was this another example of how book banning rarely works? Why do you think the practice is on the rise again? Is it specific to Tennessee, Texas? And how were you didn't go down to McMinn County, but you did speak to them on Zoom. We'd be interested in that. And thank you for joining us.
Okay, so let's see, to unpack some of this. I think that the root cause of what's happening right now just has to do with the larger culture war as we aim toward Civil War II. And as a result, a lot of the banning feels kind of hysterical and irrational, but it has a motive, and the motive has to do with taking money out of public school funds and putting them into charter schools, very often religious charter schools. And I think that's the playbook that I was witnessing when I kind of try to deconstruct it during the month-long spaceship abduction into outer space or in county, I'm not sure which, but the rise in banning has gotten much more dangerous recently, in that there are now laws, I think, in 20 some odd states that are underway, passed already in several states, including even New Hampshire, that have to do with analyzing, I think, over 800 books for not just curriculum use in a school, and hence perhaps the school library, but in libraries in general. And it includes, in some cases, these things are emanating from Texas, keeping cameras in the classroom so that and you can see if a teacher is teaching something about race that might make some of the kids uncomfortable, which at first I took comfort in until I understood that it was really about not making some white kid uncomfortable because his grandpa was in the Klan or something. So the cameras would be open not just to parents, which would be already bad enough, but to anyone. So a little bit like the abortion thing that happened recently, where it's citizens' arrests with bounties and very draconian penalties for breaking through that. $10,000 a day per occurrence for a teacher who probably can only afford 3 occurrences, before they're economically driven out of teaching.
Yet, you think, Art, that there's a kind of defunding of public schools involved at the root of the banning of books, that there's a kind of playbook as we see more cases. But I was interested in what Viet, in your essay in the Times, you wrote about also how it's about restricting empathy, and that at its root, it's also about fear of a country changing, fear of the other, maybe fear of opening kids' minds to ideas parents may not want them to know. I'm just curious, your sense, Viet, do you see that as a central piece?
Well, Art mentioned culture wars, which is absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing cycles of these kinds of things happening, even within recent memory. We had the culture wars of the 50s, culture wars of the 80s, today's culture wars. I think they're all related. And he mentioned hysteria. And so another term for understanding what's going on that's related to fear is moral panic. The United States periodically undergoes moral panics about a variety of different things. But the issue here is that the moral panic is oftentimes around questions of protecting our children, our women, our family from various kinds of threats and contaminations that are considered to be sexual or unhygienic or damaging, morally damaging in various ways. But they're also all tied into these culture wars as well. Every time there's a shift in the American body politic for whatever kind of political reason, sometimes it's directly attacked, but oftentimes it's deflected under this question of moral panic. So, the censorship around rap music in the 80s, for example, that was very much about race and class, but it was articulated by some people as a threat to the moral purity of American youth, right? So I think fear does play a big role here. Of course, when we try to censor things, we are trying to, as you mentioned, or you mentioned me saying, we're trying to stymie empathy. And of course, those of us who are in the arts as practitioners, we believe in empathy. We believe it's an absolute necessity to our practice. And so the one thing I want to say here is that on the one hand, empathy is absolutely crucial for identification, for getting people to sympathize with others who are distant from them in some kind of demographic and political sense. And it's really crucial, but at the same time, we don't want to put too much weight on empathy either, because empathy, as dangerous as some people perceive it to be, is also not as dangerous as some people perceive it to be, because empathy doesn't necessarily make us take action. We can read a book, we can be moved in some way emotionally, but we will not do anything. But I think what some people fear is that empathy could lead to action. Now, those of us who support empathy in the arts must also then take seriously the idea that empathy in itself is not enough. We also have to take action as well. And this is, we're going to talk about this, but this is what leads to the idea that we're engaged in culture wars. The idea that it's not just culture we're dealing with, but that culture is the staging ground for action, for political conflict. And we are, as a nation, engaged in all kinds of political conflict and divisions right now that are not unique to this moment, but are in fact continue throughout American history, going back to the very origins of this country.
Art, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I remember some book written, I think in the 80s by Sven Burkert about arguments against television, talking about how essentially novels are empathy machines. It's the closest you have to being able to enter into somebody else's brain and see the world through that set of eyes. And it's very effective at that. I think cumulatively, wide reading, especially of banned books, probably leads to more empathy, but also to more action for the most part. It's difficult not to get overwhelmed because there's so many things to be concerned about these days. But I think what's been happening right now in the Ukraine, which has many echoes to the past in the book that I was presenting, is interesting, sometimes talked about negatively, because why weren't we that way about Syria? Why weren't we that way about other places? And it's all true. And yet there's something about seeing somebody wandering around in a t-shirts and listening to the same music and doing the same thing that really, for a moment, had a lot of attention during that Arab Spring moment of the recent past, and now is more urgent than ever as we have this brinksmanship going on that brings us back to Cold War years and heavy duty bombings of mushroom cloud proportions. So empathy is something I'm understanding now, because I really did try to figure out why the hell was Mao's banned. I thought we were honorary white people, you know. It was more like, it's provisional. You know, it was clear under Trump, when there were good people on both sides in Carolina, South Carolina, and beyond, that, okay, it's provisional, you know, and yet it's easier to imagine a school board banning these things that affect sexual identity, for example, because every parent is totally anxious about that. And in general, a lot of the books that are banned have to do with the fact that they encourage understanding the other. If that's empathy, perhaps, but the baseline underneath Mouse, which was never meant to teach anybody anything. I was against my young kids reading it, but I gave them a copy when they were preschool and school, depending on which kid we're talking about, and said, you can read this whenever you want. You don't have to read it. Here it is. There's a copy subscribed to you with a picture, another one for you, Dash. And they eventually, of course, read it because it was the easiest access they had to a lot of the questions about my side of the family. But I think that the essence of Mao's, by using these masks of animals, that then becomes a kind of self-destructing metaphor, because it's a stupid idea. One of my collaborators was my father. The other one was Adolf Hitler, who didn't believe Jews were a race. Well, they believed they were a race, but not human, I should say. So these masks actually invite people into identification with somebody that in other circumstances they might just consider other. It's easier to identify with a mouse than with a person that doesn't look like you, let's say. None of this was fully conscious. It has its own history of how the book developed to be what it is. But I look back on it now realizing it's useful in a didactic way, although I never meant it to teach anybody but me anything. And it has to do with identifying with an other. And that's the essential way it might be useful, because I found that it's not only taught in Jewish studies courses or world history courses, but indigenous people have used it in their schools in America, and many others that have to do with understanding it's not the same situation, but one can fall into the situation rather quickly. But as I said, I believe the masks are there to kind of fall off and reveal the inanity of the projection. But it does work the way Little Orphan Annie's eyes worked in the comics, where it had these big blank eyes for Little Orphan Annie, because it's much easier to project an emotion onto this blank face than it is on something more manic, like I mentioned Little Abner before. It's all burlesque, very intensely exaggerated. But Peanuts is kind of relatively mask-faced, and it encourages deep empathy with the other. And I think Mao's does that as well. And my job was just to be as true to the story I was able to elicit, with all of its problems, because it wasn't intended for kids at all. It was intended for me to understand what happened by putting it in linear form and try to make, for the first time, a long narrative. And it's interesting to me that the hysteria that the Min County people, which are in Tennessee, the school board minutes were released accidentally the day before International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was incredibly bad PR on their part, but had to do with how slow they were in releasing their minutes. And so I've studied that in detail, trying to figure out what has been going down there. And in a sense, the panic isn't so much about covering the Holocaust. It's a unit of study. They accept that, but they want a nicer, fuzzier, warmer Holocaust that won't traumatize their kids. And to have that involves the idea that suffering ennobles on some level. I think it's even implicit in the unfortunate word Holocaust, which is a burnt offering. And that's not from the Bible Belt, but from another side of the fence. And yet in general, what it does is it kind of meant that they would be happy teaching certain books and even films that, like The Boy with Striped Pajamas, which have a Christian protagonist who becomes more and more ennobled by his friendship with a little boy on the other side of the barbed wire in a way that's inane and not based on any kind of historical research at all. And is, of course, very successful because it fulfills that narrative. My father remains as damaged as he might have even been before the war, and was certainly exacerbated by the war. And I didn't try to present an idealized portrait, and I think that's part of what became a scandal for the book, in a sense, and also what made the book so powerful as the teaching aid I never hoped it would be. In fact, I just read an essay that you wrote, Viet, about the importance of letting kids read, but another one that had to do with what your parents want you to be, and in general, trying to keep the ironies all intact. And as a result, I think that became very threatening to the school board. They never read the book, it's clear. If they read any of it, one of them confessed to reading a review of it. Most of them probably never even picked it up and just went with the herd, with the idea that if people say it's bad, it must be bad, you know? And to your point earlier, Katrina, it's like nothing like banning a book in a country that has the First Amendment to improve sales. Because unless you're willing to do, I saw that both Viet and I used the same metaphor. You can't ban books without being willing to burn them. And you can't burn them without being willing to burn the writers and readers of them. It's a hopeless quest ultimately, but it's incredibly damaging. I became a comic book artist probably because I discovered those books that were burning in the early 50s, bonfires set up by PTA groups and
Yes, yeah.
Teachers, the church and beyond, and for good reason. Some of those books really were, if not worth burning, at least worth analyzing. I would say comics, I can proudly state, has a history that includes probably the most egregious racism of any medium, even film, which
Comics Code, right? The 1950s.
Comics Code is what it led to. Yeah, this kind of voluntary self-censorship in order to remain distributed, and it killed all of the interesting stuff almost, except for the little kid comics like Donald Duck and Little Lulu were exempt, but Tales from the Crypt, Crime Does Not Pay, and Mad comics were definitely on those bonfires. And I would think Mad was my codex for understanding America.
I wanted to ask Viet if I could. There's also the culture wars, but there's also history and the debate over history in our country, and the idea that I think someone once said that history is to a country what memory is to an individual. And you're often, through your books, your writing, trying to remind people in this country of a history they don't want to know, the war and the horrors of war. And I'm wondering, in these times, do you think there will be more, I'm struck that we're seeing war on our screens in a way we haven't for many, many years, right? I mean, Art, you mentioned Syria, Iraq. We didn't see as much. We certainly didn't see Vietnam for different reasons. So I'm wondering how you think that will feed into more banning, because a lot of Americans don't want to be confronted with the history of war, of militarism, of racism.
I wonder if that's true about militarism.
You think there's a patriotic rallying around?
Again, like I have this, I'm trying to read the tea leaves from a micro event, which is my Tennessee waltz
Yep.
that lasted a month. But there, I think the ringleader of the school board, whose name I meant to look up before we started, but didn't, who then wrote something else that was published in the Tennessee Holler, a left-wing news organization that just lifts up rocks and looks at what's under them in their area. He was suggesting, of course we want to teach the Holocaust, but why don't we teach the Holocaust from the point of view of the American soldiers, you know, the ones who came in and liberated the camps? Well, there's good reasons, which is then you'd also have to teach about the Russians being much more instrumental in liberating the camps than the Americans. And it's not that story. It's, my father said, we were never liberated, the war ended, you know? So I think when you start talking about the patriotic realism, which I think is the phrase in that essay that this board leader took on, was about creating a narrative that isn't against war, it's just the heroism of war. The kind of thing that Viet was concerned about in something I read recently about his responses to looking at movies like Apocalypse Now, and rightly so, with horror.
So on the question of history, I think that the important thing for me to stress here is that all nations have a selective relationship to their history and to their memory. But within the context of the United States, of course, and this idea of the First Amendment and what makes America unique and so on, which is obviously being compromised by book banning, you know, there's a dominant American idea that we're really unique, that other countries, which really obscure their history and engage in propaganda and, you know, distort people's understandings. But we can see how horrible China and Russia and the Soviet Union are, and so on and so forth, because we are a free country with total access to information. And I think that that obviously is not true, as Art is already implying, that of course this country has a selective relationship to its own history and its own memory and narrates its best version of itself to itself. And I think what we're seeing with culture wars, past and present, is the fact that that seeming consensus on what American history is under attack. And I say seeming consensus because it's always been an imposed consensus. That is, the people with the power, that is white people, white wealthy people for the most part, white wealthy men, have gotten to determine what the consensus about American history and memory is. And so, of course, what we're living through is a very long moment of non-wealthy, non-white, non-men struggling, contesting this so-called consensus that's been imposed on us. And so once that happens, then of course the people who have benefited from the consensus get very worried. They get frightened. They have the moral panics, and they want to suppress any kind of contention. And I think when we're talking about the books that are being banned, some of the books that are being banned are probably not that great from the perspective of art, you know, but they raise issues that disturb people. And then some books, like Mouse, are great art and they disturb people because of the issues that they raise. And those books are really frightening. And that's probably one reason why Mouse is at the forefront of this versus other books, because of its artistic power in addition to the story or the content or whatever it's bringing up. And I think, of course, the people who want to ban books, even if they don't read the books, recognize that these books are really seductive. They don't want their kids to read these books because that means they lose control of their kids. I mean, that's really part of what's going on here, is that we don't want to lose control of our kids.
We want the kids to be smarter than we are.
That we can't control ourselves. And so, I mean, there's so many things going on here around history, politics, consensus, power, and all that kind of thing. But also what's going on, I think, is the question when we're talking about parents, like, what kind of a parent are you? Are you the parent who wants to utterly control everything your child accesses? Or are you the kind of parent who wants to, like, throw open the doors to the library and so on and so forth? And generally, I think artists tend to fall on the latter side, not without, I'll just use myself as an example, not without some hesitation sometimes, because I'm that parent who, as I told Art beforehand, let his 8-year-old son read Mouse. This was a couple of weeks ago. And I don't think my son has been damaged by it, but I won't know for another 20 or 30 years if that's the case. So of course, there's always that hesitation. Should my son or daughter or person read these kinds of works? And I've spoken to myself about the fact that my parents had no control over what I was reading, not because they didn't care, but because they let me go to the library and I read whatever I wanted. And I read a whole bunch of things that were really inappropriate for 11 and 12-year-old kid. that turned me into the writer that I am. And there are a lot of people who don't want me to be the writer that I am, and would have preferred that if they would have had greater control over what was in the San Jose Public Library, Viet Thanh Nguyen, the writer, would never have been produced, and that would be a good thing for this country. So I think that's what's going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that with the parental control thing, it was again very operative in my little microcosm petri dish that I had to dive into, because the real objection was hard to figure out. I don't know what ambient anti-Semitism in the Bible Belt might have affected it, but a lot of it was very focused on the idea that there were bad words in it, goddamn, and bitch was somewhere in there. And when I tried to find them, I didn't highlight them in yellow like maybe somebody on the school board did without reading the rest of the book, but they're mostly, almost all probably, I haven't scoped it, they were all weighed and measured, and they were about my anger at my parents, not at my anger at the Nazis. That was something else again. So that when I found out that my father had literally burned my mother's diaries at the end of the first volume, well, I call him a, God damn you, how could you have done that? They were for me. And I called him a murderer at that point. And then my mother, who killed herself in 1968, I did a strip when that memory got recovered in 1972. Like I, for most part, could say that my mother killed herself without thinking about any of the events around it. But in reconstructing all that, when it came flooding back, I remember just how, not just bereft, but furious I was at her for abandoning me. The strip was called Prisoner on the Hell Planet, and she had left me on my own on the Hell Planet, and I call her a bitch, as there's a small image of her wrist being sliced in a bathtub. And then the bathtub was the third element, which had to do with it being described. That was what offended me more than anything that offended the McMinn County people, was described as a nude woman, as opposed to a naked corpse who had killed herself in a bathtub, and has a rather non-graphic representation of her in the bathtub, but it does have a dot that could be seen as a nipple, and that, assuming these people are mammals, they might have seen before, but nevertheless, that was the core. And it had to do with honoring thy father and mother. I don't remember which commandment it is, but it's one of those 10. And that was the inciting incident for the moral panic, I think, that they experienced. How could you not obey your parents? If they're on a school board, they're interested in having authority, and authoritarians love to exercise their authority. It's just the nature of the beast. So a lot of it was really genuinely focused on that, not just as a fig leaf, although part of it may have had to do with our confusing defense of the First Amendment. The closest we have to a precedent in America with schools and school boards and libraries is something that happened in Long Island, called, I think, Three Trees versus Pico, which was a fuzzy decision that didn't make it clear. It made it clear that you're better off not banning a book for its content, but for its inappropriateness for young people. And that's where the fuzziness of this is, because it's so easy as a call to arms to say, do you know what kind of poisons the school is feeding your children? And at that point, poison children, what? So I think that's where a lot of the focus has been, including, as I was mentioning before we started, this group called Moms for Liberty, which is one of those Orwellian switches of meaning for words. Very well funded, that deals on a county to county school board level across the country, well funded by, among others, the Kochs. And it's literally about making sure your kids can get their Bible training at the taxpayer's expense.
Thank you, Art. I was just to say, it does seem to go back to control. You started with the sort of sense of the parental control. And the revival of school boards is, again, a cyclical. We saw it in the 70s very clearly with Falwell, and remember the back to the schools. And just to remind Virginia, the race in Virginia was determined in some ways by the Democratic candidate saying parents should not be involved in the schools. And it kind of, so the issue of control, but I wanted to ask both of you, this is a question you remember when Katie Couric asked Sarah Palin what she read? And Palin kind of fudged the answer. In the Supreme Court hearings this week, it seems pretty evident that many senators and their staffs are not big readers. Maybe they don't have time. In what ways, to the point about history and knowledge, what should be asked of those running for office about their reading? Is that, And should we, it's sort of a knowledge of history that would be good set of debates.
It's a good act of public shaming, I guess. And of course, President Obama set the bar pretty high with his annual list of books and so on. But I'm not sure you can, again, it goes back to the idea of whether we as a country are capable of being shamed anymore for a variety of different issues, not just reading, but it might be embarrassing, as in the case of Sarah Palin. I don't remember that incident because I've tried to forget everything about Sarah Palin in that particular moment of history. But all that will happen, I think, if we ask senators what they read, is that they will present us with a curated list of whatever it is they think is appropriate for their base and their self-image. So I'm skeptical about that. I think, of course, obviously, what part of what we've been touching on is the role of literature in education, both formal education in schools, but informal education that takes place in libraries and homes and all that. What we should really be doing as a country, obviously, is trying to expand people's access to books, to libraries, to reading in every way that we could. That would hopefully be seemingly a bipartisan possibility. But of course, we'll get into all these battles about what books should be included on such lists. But in general, supporting our public schools and our libraries to have even greater numbers of books of any kind would be a bonus for this country.
Absolutely.
Well, Francoise, my wife, who grew up in France, has been baffled by a lot of this because, for one thing, public schools are public schools. They're made to make you a responsible member of the public. Going to a private school is almost shameful. It's like you weren't good enough to make the grade. In the national schools, and of course, public schools curricula aren't controlled by the parents. They're controlled by people who've been trained to do this stuff. And ultimately, I think that's one of the problems with what's happening now, which is the idea that we can't trust our teachers and the people building our curricula. I would much rather have the kids of McMinn read the Turner Diaries or Mein Kampf in a curriculum setting than if they find it on their dad's shelf, So that just is basic, because a curriculum allows you to shape something all around it. So that another thing planned by, it seems to me, a fairly good curriculum planning by the people in McMinn who are witnesses and respondents to the school board decision. Even then, they were agreeing to censor some of the bad words, although that was absurd, but I think they were trying to mollify, because what they really were trying to do is explain, look, we can't pull this book out because it relates to the thing before that has to do with the earlier part of the curriculum dealt with food, and I think food scarcity around the world. And the third part had to do, among other things, with Japanese internment camps during World War II. So it had a function, and they wanted their kids to try to draw comics as well. And by age 12, it's all manageable. It's not like, I don't know what your son got out of Mouse, and maybe it'll lead him to Tom and Jerry cartoons, I don't know. But it's all part and parcel of where's the responsibility for teaching. If anything, we need to give these curricula ideas more support. Mouse was happily taught in McMinn County for many years in 8th grade. It's interesting to me that it got yanked.
Well, looking back, I think in a recent interview, the interviewer thought you were more rattled about what was happening today. But the history of censorship in the United States, you talked about the comic codes. Do you think things, and this is crudely stated, are getting better, are getting worse? Are there new dynamics, the social media, the recalibration of brains? I'm just, I don't know if there's a way to pinpoint that, but it's through the cycles of history.
Well, yeah, it's been an issue from the earliest books getting banned to now. There's been a history of finding books dangerous, and they are, that's a good thing, in that it does that kind of opening up of perspectives. And it's exactly what's a problem when I think it was you that mentioned the need to control how this thing was working, because we're getting replaced, right? White people are not going to be in the majority within 15, 20 years. And that's created a real panic that included that march in South Carolina that led to the quote that I mentioned by Trump, but which really had to do with them chanting, you shall not replace us, right? As
Yes.
opposed to the more organic history that was still being taught when I was a kid, even during the communist panic, was really about the melting pot. The Statue of Liberty, which up at least until the teens was a beacon of what it meant to be a multi-ethnic society, and was as much a dream as as all men being created equal is in our Constitution. So the panic is real, and the panic is exacerbated now because we have less in common with each other, in quotes, now. And it's when I was mentioning how important my meetings with people in Tennessee who weren't like that, one of the interlocutors in the public webinar that I asked for was amazing. She's an activist in Tennessee. She was born there. She grew up there. She read Mao's in 8th grade. She read it again when she was in grad school. And she wrote an essay in a local paper about how the coastal elites are just exacerbating the problem because it makes everything more polarized rather than possible. She says she needs to build bridges with these people because it's really her home. Her daughter's in the school now system in McMinn. And for that to work involves finding a way around all of the walls that are being built up out of fear in order to let that happen. So it may be a bridge too far, but she's trying hard, and I tried to run with her. She made me a better person by enforcing this thing, by pointing to this thing, to keep me from just going off into my wacky caricature version of everything.
Yet, is there? Yeah. The New York Times, I wanted to ask, the New York Times had a big statement a few weeks ago. America has a free speech problem. And in it, it's kind of equated. How is this problem depluralization of America? It's because the political left and the right are caught in a destructive loop of condemnation and recrimination around cancel culture. This is a big topic, but I wonder what you think of that seemingly the equivalence gambit and how you relate to this moment around free speech. I know that art, and this is just one example. In the 70s, you supported the ACLU when it defended those who marched in Skokie. I think the ACLU, even at that time, lost about half of its membership. And the ACLU, a great institution, it's 100 years strong, I think would have a problem today. Doing the Skokie defense. So I'm just where you see the calibration of free speech, this equivalent notion.
I think the difference is that the right has been very good at colonizing states and even counties toward their agenda, so that everything is not just moral suasion, but legally being created as literal bannings. We don't want these books in schools. This is the list. If you violate it, you're in trouble. And that's different than saying, this is upsetting my kids in the classroom to hear the N-word, to the TV screen here, when they read Huckleberry Finn, for example, and books like To Kill a Mockingbird, like falling like weirdly on both sides at various points in its history as to who wants to ban it. And clearly it's not as bad to try to persuade people to not do this to avoid offense. But I as a First Amendment fundamentalist, though not a religious fundamentalist, believe that all things have to be aired. And I think that we give context. That's why curricula are much better than what I did and what Viet did of like, here's your library, just go to it, figure it out, man. And that's the only way it ever gets figured out, is if you enter in deeply enough to like try to understand what the actual situation is.
Yeah, I think I'm a free speech fundamentalist too. And I think what's going on, first of all, there's a distinction between civil society, that is people on Twitter, for example, deciding to supposedly cancel somebody versus a school board censoring books. These are two very different things. They both have social and political consequences. There's no doubt about it, but they're still qualitatively different. And I don't think the progressive left, for example, is undertaking any campaign to censor books in the same way that the right is doing in this country. But the question about free speech and who gets to say what, and these are symptomatic struggles, which is to say that we're having these battles because of other issues happening in American society. So, the question of what can be said in a classroom, for example, around certain words, certain ideas, that kind of stuff. I mean, that is related again to the question of who this country is, who has had the power to say certain things to certain people, who has gotten the ability to define what consensus and civility is. So people who are upset about cancellation and saying, well, this is just uncivil behavior, historically in this country, civility has been used to suppress the speech, the free speech of a lot of people in this country who don't match the definition of what is civil. So that's the real issue. And we are not going to be able to, determine the outcome of these larger political and social struggles by saying what can and can't be said or spoken, right? And so that is obviously really crucial. Now, there is obviously a lot of pain when one is canceled or when one feels that one can't say a certain thing. And there's no doubt that there's orthodoxies on both the right and the left. And as much as, well, I'm going to say we, I think we're generally on the left or the progressive side in this forum, as much as we might look at the right and say they have orthodoxies and they have silencings and they need to take care of that, we on the left do that as well in different ways. And so we also have to be able to figure out, when that is happening and how to address that within our own social and political environments.
We published an issue years ago. It was called a special issue against civility, because it is used often to suppress and used by power to suppress. This may not be.
To add to what you
say, please.
The difference between the left and the right on this particular issue has to do with shaming rather than enforcing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue. And it's unfortunate that it actually has an effect. The squelching. I know a lot of writers and artists who are much more guarded than they used to be, because who needs the aggravation? You try to find your way through and then find out that somebody has virtually signaled and built up like a 24-hour Twitter storm of some kind to get this book out of circulation, in the sense of avoid this book. This person's not passing the purity test, as if any human ever really does. So it's effective, even though it's not the same as the much more organized and more pernicious thing that has to do with having focused on federal judgeships much more than the Democrats. The Republican Party has been very smart about it. It's not the word I actually want to use, but okay. They've been very canny about controlling things on a local level, and it's been helpful for what I see as a dangerous tendency that we're living through.
Yet you teach those who want to be writers. How has I'm curious on a number of fronts how social media has affected their thinking about writing, what they're reading, and do they seek out, both in novels, in writing fiction and nonfiction, what you might think of as controversial topics, or do they go for smaller, more narrow, careful?
Well, you have to define what constitutes controversy, because when we're talking about writers live generally, like literary writers, artistic writers, live in our own cultural and political sphere. That is to say that the people who are editing us, publishing us, reviewing us tend to come from the same universe. Right. So what constitutes controversy is quite different. I mean, you can talk about any kind of scandalous issue within literature, and it's not really that scandalous for the most part within the publishing world and its environment. It's when it gets out into something like being banned by the Tennessee school district or something that it might be controversial. But as Art's case shows, being banned is a good thing, because we're talking about mirror opposites here in terms of the artistic and cultural world versus this other world where the controversies might be stoked, and vice versa. of course. What would be controversial in the artistic publishing world would be if you wrote a novel as a young artist, for example, endorsing book banning or endorsing burning homosexuals or something. That would be controversial. And nobody I know is doing that kind of stuff. So there's consensus on both the left and the right generally around these kinds of things. Now, on social media, what I would say is I got off a lot of social media because I felt that what Art was talking about, the internalization of shame and the fear of the mob was true. Like but also it works in reverse. The pleasure taken in consensus. You know, when I would do a tweet and it would get 100,000 likes, I'd be like, "Oh, I'm popular. That feels good." And then when I would do a tweet and people wouldn't like it, and I would be like, "Oh my God, this is painful." You know, so that is not, I don't think, a healthy environment for writers in particular to be engaged in. And yet at the same time, because we live in a media saturated, celebrity saturated world in general, younger writers are compelled, many of them, to go online and do this kind of stuff, whether they like it or not. So there's a conditioning that's happening here through social media that, you know, in some ways obviously is good in the sense that you can use Twitter or whatever other social media as a writing platform, which I did, but then you're subjected to this culture of consensus, conformity, of the mob and so on, that is in some ways antithetical to what how some writers want to live.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, unfortunately, like what Katrina was saying before about looking into the Skokie thing, being first horrified by it and then realizing, no, if you want to protect the center, you have to protect the perimeter. Otherwise, it's just a creep. And it imprinted on me. I think I was in high school then. And I've been a card-carrying ACLU member ever since. And I've also been brought up in a culture, which was the culture of the 60s, of being banned is good and being controversial is good. And it wasn't about book sales. It was about like breaking the shibboleths and seeing what was around it, sometimes in a misguided way, sometimes very pointed and on target, but that it was actually an aspiration. So in a sense, I feel like I got a diploma in Tennessee for a lifetime of battering at things that otherwise were not quite consensus at that moment.
There's a term, pajamification. Have you, like,
Yes.
smoothing out, homogenization of the work. I'm struck, I don't know, I watched a decent amount of TV, but The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Lenny Bruce has been kind of smoothed out. You don't get the edges, and that's part of our culture. But you began Art talking about public schools, and how is book banning related to the funding for charter schools? Is it, I mean, is it part of, this is a question from a reader in, well, Molly McCone. I think it's part of an attack on public education, maybe, but
by replacing it with schools more sympathetic to the more regressive forces, they also have the economic cloud at that point to remove that money and put them in a religious school specifically, right. Let's say. So it's giving more power to the parent than to the people who've been educated enough to become educators. And it's why I think funding's, I think maybe it was Beto O'Rourke who just was raising this as an issue of we need more funding for teachers and libraries, and that seems absolutely correct. Not more policing of teachers and libraries, because it's terrifying. It's an impossibly difficult job. It's done by people who really want to do it usually because they're educated, and this is not the best way to monetize your education. And they're drummed out of the core after too much of this starts being pointed at them. And if they were encouraged, then we could trust it as a public education, the way I was referring to what happens in France. To your earlier point about what books do you read? In yes. France, I would think, living through a few elections cycles there, you really do have to talk about what books you've read, and you have to talk about them rather than just list them. And here, the closest you'd come to that is, which movies are your favorite movies? Because that's something people could embrace, you know, and sometimes there's a rather bizarre result from even what movies they like.
Just a chip here. Number one, I fetishize French culture too. Yeah, I mean, they actually authors. Well, that's awesome. But on the question of charter schools and books, I think the relationship is that, charter schools are a phenomenon of neoliberalism and privatization, deregulation, right? So let's not have the state do things like run education. Let's give it over to entrepreneurs and capitalists who then can do whatever they want in their own individual space. That's freedom. But at the same time, the regulation side is that the state will come in and regulate certain kinds of moral issues. Now, the left and the right have different perceptions of what constitutes something that's worth regulating. But here on the question of books, the right wants to regulate or enforce, as Art said, what people can read. But then at the same time, they want to deregulate what is taught. There's a real contradiction there. But I think that's what's happening.
I wanted to ask how you see the COVID era, which we're still in, affecting some of what you just spoke about, Viet, the sort of public space, public libraries as public space, parks as public space, but reading as also a kind of commitment in a time when we didn't have as many distractions in a sense. But I wanted to ask both of you about libraries, because they've been challenged in ways, but they are fundamentally a part of the public good. And if you see in your communities vitality around libraries, there's a resurgence in New York City. And I'm not thinking really of the main library at 42nd, but the branches, both using books, but also to be honest, broadband for work and for schoolwork, for job searches. But I think libraries and librarians factor into this discussion. I'm curious how you see.
Yeah, absolutely. As a professor, I spend most of my time in research libraries, university libraries. These are very kinds of pure spaces and regulated spaces. You have to have paid your tuition and so on to get into them. So they're very different than public libraries. But as a parent, I've gone to many of these branch libraries now with my son. And what's really striking to me is the vast difference between private research libraries and public libraries. Private research libraries have a very specialized function. Public libraries, as you say, are now communal spaces. I mean, they're obviously about books, but they're about so much more. So I'm impressed by the fact that in public libraries, you can rent movies and music, you can do job searches. And if you're a kid, you can play with Legos. And also that in a public library, it is a democratic space, like you're saying, for better and for worse, but generally for better, which is that all kinds of people can come into a public library of all kinds of different backgrounds, and they do literally have to sit next to each other, which would include sitting next to sometimes people who are without homes. And so librarians, I think, are facing such a challenge out here because I don't know what they're being trained for in library school, but it's not just about information and books anymore. It's about providing social services and community services, because we as a society have not been providing those social and community services elsewhere, and libraries as public spaces have taken up the slack. So attacks on public libraries are, again, not just attacks on knowledge and on books, but attacks on public spaces and on one of the last bastions of providing social services to people in need as well.
Yeah, I wanted to be a librarian when I had to give a more realistic job description to my father, who wanted me to be a doctor, or at least a dentist, because now even dentists were doctors, he explained. But that ultimately being around books just sounded good to me. And to your point before about how Skokie would be hard to protect in 2022, you'd never be able to start something like public libraries in 2022. It's a much earlier.
I do think librarians have been at the forefront.
Absolutely, it's risky.
Freedom to read and anti-banning, and in that they're kind of heroes of our time. I wanted to ask both of you. Sure.
I'm in earshot, but I'll be out.
Yeah. I think you wrote a book with your son. I think, but I was going to ask you, an example of a book that you recently have read with your kids, that you've had to explain, or that has been difficult and disturbing in terms of a conversation. Or
well, I'll take credit for saying that I already had Art's Mouse on my college syllabus course, and I'd done it before. I organized this last semester, so when Art's book got banned, it was perfect for me. I was like, I seem prescient. But because I was teaching it, my 8-year-old son saw Mouse 1 and 2, and he just picked it up and read them because he's a comic book fan. And his reaction to it was, I like it. And we haven't yet had the chance to get into any more detailed conversation, but the part of the point here is that comic books, I think, have been the source of a lot of panic and fear because they're so accessible to people of all ages. And so comic books I think of as a gateway drug for my son, because he started off reading Marvel and like DC and everything like that, but now he's reading Mouse. He's reading George Takei's comic book memoir about the internment camps and so much other kinds of stuff. And we did talk about New Kid, which is a book by Jerry Croft that did get banned as well. And New Kid is about a boy of color, mixed race. He's Black, but he's a light-skinned Black boy who goes to this elite, prestigious private school where he is one of the few non-white students there. And and of course it caused controversy. Some parent in Texas wanted to ban it, partly because it made her uncomfortable and brought up white privilege and featured Karens. Some of the worst characters in the book are not outright racist, but white people who engage in microaggression against these Black kids. And we were reading it, my son and I, and I was like, do you know why this book got banned? And he said, I don't know why this book got banned, because it makes some white people feel uncomfortable. So this is exactly the kind of conversations that the people who want to ban New Kid and other books like it don't want kids and parents to have. That's what they really want to stymie.
Well, and comics are a problem in part because, as you say, they're accessible, but why they're useful now that kind of the 1950s pallor of the squelching of comic books is because we need to be visually literate as well as verbally literate now. And comics not only encourage it, they teach it intuitively, just because you're making your way through this labyrinth of pictures to try to like extract the story juice from it, I suppose. But the result of that is a deep education in how pictures are working on you. And the fact that they stay still, unlike movies, and are more immediate than verbal language very often, means that you're kind of entering in directly and then have it stand still so you can re-examine it either on your own. I'm hoping that your son will read Mao's again further down the road, because as I said, I actually had objected when I got a young adult best book award from the New York Public Library System, saying I worked 13 years on this damn book to show what that comics don't have to just be for children. And then I got proven wrong over a period of years because I met so many kids who understood what they were reading, and so many people like the ones on the school board who, if they read any of it at all, had no clue as to what it was actually about.
Well, I'll say as someone like, my novel, The Sympathizer, when kids in high school read it, I love it. I was like, I didn't think about them, but the fact that the book is actually available to them and that some of them get it and like it is terrific. But I will say that, going back to the comic book question, we see controversies in comic books like, oh, now this superhero is Black or this superhero is gay. And I think that has riled up, certain kinds of readers of comic books and fans of Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. And again, it's because of the accessibility of these media. And what they testify to is, again, the enduring power of art to open our minds, to provoke us, to entertain us, and to change us at the same time. And some people want to rein in that power, again, with the reduction of art simply to the idea of being either entertainment or pedagogy, when art is all those things, but also provocation and transformation as well.
Yeah, I'd say also that for all of what I was saying that was casting some shade on trying to remove, say, Huckleberry Finn as a benign example of things through shaming. What's interesting now is a lot of these books are being written and drawn by gay and Black writers and artists, which is a first. I mean, closeted gays were probably in comics from the earliest years of comic books, but now that is informing the books in a different way. And that's one of the healthier sides of what's been happening in the current culture war.
I want to thank Art and Viet for this extraordinary conversation. I take hope from this, the enduring power of art. And I think, Viet, in your essay, you wrote about how important ideas are. And I think there's always been an attempt to control ideas, and the proxies that we see now, so much is about control and not humanizing, quote, the other. But this was a wonderfully, I want to ask Art one last question, but first of all, I hope you'll draw for the nation again. But what was your...
I climb out from under my being run over by a Chattanooga choo-choo or whatever metaphor I want to use.
We have to repair Tennessee's reputation. But I want to thank you, Viet, for participating in many nation events in this last last 2 years. And Art, it's great to see you again. You always cause trouble when you I was going to ask you what was the most controversial cover that you did not anticipate?
Many of them at the beginning. Then eventually I was getting so encouraged for being controversial that I pushed myself in areas I could have easily stayed out of. But the very first one about that I did for the New Yorker, when it was climbing out of its Connecticut countryside, post-impressionist covers, was the Hasidic kiss, where in the wake of the Crown Heights mess, I had a Hasidic man kissing a Black woman. And that I didn't understand that it was even controversial. I was just trying to figure out what would Eustace Tilley, the guy with the monocle, look like if he was Hasidic. And then that led to that cover somehow, because the Crown Heights reverb was still there. And there you really need to have a kind of visual literacy to understand it. Like the best letter that came into the New Yorker was from a young girl thinking that it was really sweet that it was Valentine's Day, that it was really sweet that it was a picture of Abraham Lincoln kissing a slave. So pictures require context and education as well, just to understand what point are they trying to make. Now it's an often requested image because the guardrails have been moved, and now there's nothing especially wrong in large parts of the country in what used to be called miscegenation.
Thank you for reminding us again. I mean, let's all move forward and make sure there are no banned books. Though I just received an email before our conversation saying ban books, buy them. So this is the power of banned books, but the power of the enduring freedom of speech and humanism. And I want to thank all of the people who participated and asked questions. And may we regroup in a time when there are no, how to put it, there's no clampdown because of fear and the moral panic. I think we have some long days ahead, but to stay strong is what this conversation gave us. Thank you so much. Take care of it.
Thanks for lending yourself to this, Viet. Thank you.
Thank you, Viet. Thank you, Art.
Thanks.